Hello, friend. Tonight, we're not going to talk about battles or explosions. We're not going to speak of empires that fell with a crash. Instead, I want to tell you about something quieter. Something slower. Something that feels like watching the sunset over a very old city where the stones remember more than the people do. This is a story about tiredness. About how even the greatest things in the world don't always end with noise. Sometimes, they just stop trying to stay awake. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop. And let me tell you about the long, slow evening of an empire that once stretched across 3 continents. Let me tell you about the Ottoman fade. The sun set earlier than it used to. Not because the days were shorter, but because the light seemed tired of climbing the minarets. It slipped behind the hills without ceremony, without the fiery drama it once had. The sky turned a pale gold, then ash, then a soft bruising purple that settled over the domes and towers like a blanket someone forgot to pull tight. In the courtyard of the palace, the stones were still warm from the afternoon, but no one lingered to feel them. The guards changed shifts without speaking. Their boots made the same sounds they always had, but the rhythm was slower now, as if even routine had learned to conserve its energy. There were fewer footsteps than there used to be. Fewer voices. Fewer reasons to hurry. The empire was still standing. That much was true. But it had stopped running. It had stopped chasing. It walked now, and sometimes it simply stood still, looking at the horizon as if trying to remember why it had ever moved at all. This was not the sound of collapse. This was the sound of something deciding, quietly, that rest was no longer optional. This was the beginning of a long, slow evening that would stretch across decades. And like all endings that come gently, it would be mistaken for many other things before anyone dared to call it by its name. The palace walls had seen everything. They had been built by hands that believed in forever. Thick limestone blocks, hauled from quarries that no longer existed, stacked by men whose names were gone but whose sweat had seeped into the mortar. The walls remembered the day they were raised. They remembered the sound of drums and the weight of new banners snapping in the wind. They remembered when the empire was young and hungry, when every sunrise brought another border to cross, another city to take, another map to redraw. But walls do not stay young. They grow heavy with memory. The palace had absorbed centuries of voices, arguments, celebrations, screams. It had held the weight of crowns and swords and treaties. It had been painted and patched and reinforced so many times that it no longer knew what it had looked like when it was new. The stones were tired. Not cracked, not crumbling, but tired in a way that went deeper than damage. They had carried too much for too long. Every war had left to wait. Every decision had pressed down. Even the victories, those bright moments that once lifted spirits, had added to the burden, because victories had to be defended, maintained, remembered. And now the walls stood not because they were strong, but because they had forgotten how to fall. The minarets still pointed upward, but they no longer seemed to reach. The domes still crowned the skyline, but they looked less like declarations and more like questions. The palace was a monument to its own past, and monuments do not move. They stand. They endure. But they do not run. Inside the great halls, the air was cooler than it should have been. Not the pleasant cool of evening, but the damp chill of spaces that no longer hold enough warmth. The tapestries hung without motion. The chandeliers, though polished, seemed dim even when lit. Light did not fill these rooms the way it used to. It lingered near the windows and died before it reached the walls. And in the silence, the palace breathed. Slowly, heavily, like something that had been holding its breath for so long that exhaling felt like surrender. The throne room was never empty, but it was rarely full. Advisors came and went, their footsteps echoing too loudly against marble that had once absorbed the noise of crowds. The throne itself sat at the far end, draped in fabric that had been replaced so many times no one remembered the original color. It was red now, or maybe it was burgundy, or perhaps it had simply faded into something between the two. The man who sat on it did not look like a conqueror. He looked like someone who had inherited a house too large to heat. His robes were embroidered with symbols of authority, threads of gold that caught the light in ways that suggested power. But his hands rested too still on the armrests. His gaze moved across the room without landing on anything. He listened to reports. He nodded. He signed documents with a hand that had signed 1,000 others. But there was no urgency in his movements, no fire in his responses. He was not a bad ruler. He was simply a tired one. He had taken the throne knowing it was heavier than it looked, and he had carried it as well as anyone could. But carrying is not the same as lifting. And after a while, even standing still becomes a feat of endurance. The advisors spoke in low voices. They brought news from distant provinces, updates on borders, requests for resources that were no longer abundant. They phrased everything carefully, as if the wrong word might shatter something fragile. And perhaps it would. The empire was still vast on the maps, still marked in bold ink across 3 continents. But ink does not feel the weight of distance. Ink does not know when a province stops answering letters. The discussions in the throne room were long, but they reached few conclusions. Decisions were delayed. Committees were formed. More reports were requested. It was not indecision born of confusion. It was the exhaustion of men who knew that every choice would cost something they could not afford to spend. So they spoke. And they waited. And they spoke again. And outside the windows, the sun continued to set earlier than it used to. The maps had been redrawn so many times that the paper was soft as cloth. Borders had shifted, expanded, contracted, blurred. Once, the cartographers had worked with tide, their pens tracing lines that claimed mountains, rivers, coastlines. They had drawn the empire as if it were a living thing, growing, reaching, swallowing. But now the maps showed something different. The lines were still there, but they were older. Some of them no longer matched the reports. Some provinces had stopped sending updates. Some cities had quietly slipped into the control of others, not through war, but through absence. No one had ordered a retreat. No battle had been lost. The empire had simply stopped arriving in certain places, and after a while, those places stopped waiting. The messengers still traveled, but they took longer to return. Some did not return at all. The roads were not less safe. They were simply less traveled. The idea of the empire, the weight of its name, still carried influence. But influence is not the same as presence. And presence requires effort. The court still received letters from distant governors. Some were pleased for support. Some were reassurances that all was well. Some were carefully worded farewells disguised as reports. No one said the word loss aloud. No one admitted that the empire was shrinking. But everyone knew, the way you know that winter is coming even before the first frost. The way you feel a tooth loosen before it falls. The maps were not updated as often as they used to be. There was no point. The new borders would only be temporary. And besides, the old maps were more comforting. They showed an empire that had been. And in the throne room, in the dim light of evening, It was easier to look at what had been than to measure what remained. There were rooms in the palace that remembered glory, not as a concept, but as a physical memory. The scent of incense from celebrations long past, the faint echo of music that had once poured from open doors, the scratches on the floor from tables that had been moved for banquets, for treaty signings, for the kinds of gatherings that made history feel close enough to touch. Those rooms were quieter now, not because they had been abandoned, but because they were no longer necessary. Once, the palace had needed space for guests, for delegations, for the constant motion of an empire that never stopped negotiating, trading, expanding. Now, most of the rooms served as storage, not for treasures, but for the remnants of routine. Old uniforms, unused furniture, stacks of documents that no one had time to read but felt wrong to discard. The palace staff still cleaned these rooms, but less frequently. Dust gathered in the corners, not from neglect, but from the simple fact that no one disturbed it. The doors were kept closed, not locked, just closed. And behind them, the past sat in neat rows, waiting for someone to need it again. But need is a strange thing. It fades when you stop asking. And the empire had stopped asking for a lot of things. It no longer asked for expansion. It no longer asked for innovation. It asked only for continuity, for one more year that looked like the last, or the preservation of what had been, even if that meant letting go of what could be. In the grand hall, where once the walls had been covered with banners from every conquered land, there were now only a few. The rest had been taken down, not in defeat, but in a quiet acknowledgement that they no longer represented anything current. The banners that remained were old. Their colors had faded. The fabric had grown brittle. But they hung because they always had, because removing them would have felt like an admission. And no one was ready to admit anything yet. At night, when the palace finally settled into silence, there was a particular kind of stillness that filled the hallways. It was not the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of waiting. The guards walked their routes, their footsteps soft and rhythmic. The oil lamps flickered in their brackets, casting shadows that stretched and bent along the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain still ran, its water trickling over stones that had been carved 300 years ago. The sound was soothing, constant, but it was also lonely, because it was one of the few sounds left. The palace had once been full of noise, conversations in a dozen languages, the clatter of kitchens preparing feasts, the rustle of silk as dignitaries moved through the halls, the sharp crack of commands being given and obeyed. Now, the palace was full of space, and space, when it is not filled, becomes its own presence. You could walk from one end of the palace to the other and meet only a handful of people. You could stand in the throne room and hear your own breathing. You could sit in the library and realize that no one had opened most of these books in years. It was not neglect. It was simply that the empire had grown too tired to read, too tired to debate, too tired to dream in the loud, reckless way that young powers dream. The empire had become old, not in years, but in spirit. And old things do not rage. They do not fight against the inevitable. They simply settle. They find a comfortable place to rest. They close their eyes. They let the world move on without them. And sometimes, that is not surrender. Sometimes, that is just exhaustion finally winning. The soldiers still drilled in the courtyards, but their formations were smaller now. The uniforms were the same. The commands were the same. But the men inside the uniforms were different. They had not fought in a great war. They had not stormed a city. They had stood guard. They had marched in parades. They had maintained the appearance of readiness, but readiness for what? No one could quite say. The old soldiers, the ones who had seen battle, were mostly gone. Some had died. Some had retired. Some had simply faded into the countryside, taking their stories with them. The new soldiers knew the drills. They knew the history, but they did not know the weight. They wore the uniform of an empire, but they had only ever served a state. And a state is different from an empire. A state governs. An empire commands. A state holds borders. An empire erases them. The young soldiers were capable. They were disciplined. But they were not conquerors. They were custodians. And there is no shame in that. But there is a difference. In the evenings, after the drills, they would sit in the barracks and talk about the future. Not the empire's future. Their own. Where they might go after their service. What trades they might learn. Whether they would return to their villages or try their luck in the cities. They spoke of the empire the way one speaks of a distant relative. With respect. With a vague sense of obligation. But not with passion. The fire that had once burned in the hearts of soldiers, the belief that they were part of something larger than themselves, something destined, something unstoppable, that fire had dimmed. Not extinguished. Just dimmed. And in its place was something quieter. Something more practical. The understanding that life goes on. That empires rise and fall. That men eat and sleep and grow old regardless of what flag they serve. And maybe that understanding was not a weakness. Maybe it was just the truth finally being acknowledged. The foreign envoys still came to the palace, but they came differently now. Once, they had arrived with caution, with the careful language of those who negotiate with power. Now, they arrived with a different kind of caution. The caution of those who do not wish to offend, but who also do not wish to waste time. The meetings were shorter. The treaties were more complex, filled with clauses that favored the other side in ways that would have been unthinkable a century ago. But the empire signed them. Because the alternative was conflict, and conflict required resources that were no longer abundant. Energy that was no longer there. Will that had been spent. The envoys were polite. They praised the empire's history. They spoke of friendship and mutual benefit. But their eyes moved quickly over the palace, noting the empty rooms, the reduced staff, the slower pace. They were measuring. Not with cruelty, but with the cold assessment of those who needed to know where power truly lay. And power, they could see, was shifting. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small concessions. A trade route given up. A border adjustment accepted. A request for aid that went unanswered. The empire was not being conquered. It was being politely, gradually, inevitably replaced. The world was moving faster now. New technologies. New ideas. New nations that had not existed 100 years ago. And the empire, for all its history, for all its grandeur, was still moving at the speed it always had. Which meant it was falling behind. Not in a race. There was no race. But in relevance. In the ability to shape the world rather than simply exist within it. The envoys left with their signed treaties. They bowed. They smiled. They promised to return. And they did return. But each time, they stayed a little less long. There were nights when the Sultan could not sleep. Not because of worry, though there was plenty to worry about. but because of a feeling he could not name. A sense that something was ending, but he could not see what. He would rise from his bed and walk through the palace, past the sleeping guards, past the dark hallways, until he reached the balcony that overlooked the city. From there, he could see the rooftops, the domes, the minarets silhouetted against the night sky. He could see the lights in the windows, scattered and dim, like stars that had fallen too close to earth. The city was still there. The empire was still there. But it felt distant, like something he was watching rather than something he was part of. He thought about his predecessors, the men who had sat on this throne before him, the ones who had expanded the borders, the ones who had crushed rebellions, the ones who had built monuments and commanded armies and shaped the world through sheer force of will. He wondered if they had ever felt this way, if they had ever stood on this balcony and felt the weight of history pressing down so hard that even breathing seemed like an effort. Or had they been different, stronger, more certain? He did not know. History remembered their victories. It did not record their doubts. He stayed on the balcony until the sky began to lighten, the first pale glow of dawn creeping over the hills, the city slowly coming to life, the call to prayer rising from the minarets. And he felt, not hopelessness, but something close to it. A kind of resignation, the understanding that he was not the ruler of a rising empire. He was the steward of a fading one. And perhaps that was all right. Perhaps every great thing must have its twilight. Perhaps the only sin was pretending otherwise. The palace librarians were old men now. They had spent their lives among the books, the scrolls, the maps, the records of an empire that had generated more paperwork than any kingdom before it. Every conquest had been documented, every treaty copied and filed, every tax record preserved. The library was vast, shelves that stretched higher than a man could reach without a ladder, rooms that branched into other rooms, sections that no one had visited in decades. It was a monument to memory, to the belief that everything mattered, that nothing should be forgotten. But memory, like everything else, requires maintenance, and the library had not been maintained the way it used to be. The roof leaked in places. Some of the older scrolls had begun to mold. The ink on certain documents had faded to the point of illegibility. The librarians did what they could. They moved the most important texts to drier rooms. They copied what could still be read. They made lists of what was lost. But there were only a few of them now, and the library was enormous. One of the librarians, the oldest, had been there for 50 years. He remembered when the library had been full of scholars, when students came from across the empire to study, when the Sultan himself would visit to consult the maps, to read the histories, to understand the world through the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Now, the library was quiet. A scholar came once a month, maybe. Usually someone researching their family lineage, or a clerk looking for a precedent in some old legal case. The librarian helped them find what they needed. He was always polite, always knowledgeable. But after they left, he would sit among the shelves and feel the weight of all the words that no one was reading, all the knowledge that was slowly becoming irrelevant, not because it was false, but because the world it described no longer existed. He wondered sometimes what would happen to the library when he died. The other librarians were younger, but not by much. And there were no apprentices, no young men eager to spend their lives among old books. He supposed the library would remain. Buildings do not disappear just because they are not used. But he knew that unused things eventually become forgotten things. And forgotten things, even when they are preserved, are a kind of death. The city beyond the palace walls was changing in ways the palace could not. New buildings were rising, but they were built in styles that did not match the old. Narrow, functional, efficient. The grand architecture of the past required time and money and a belief in permanence that no longer felt justified. The markets were still full, but the goods were different. Fabrics from factories instead of looms. Tools made of new metals. Books printed in languages that used different alphabets. The people in the streets moved quickly. They wore clothes that were easier to move in, easier to clean, easier to afford. They spoke of work and wages and opportunities. They spoke of the future the way people speak of something that belongs to them, not something granted by a distant throne. The old families, the ones who had served the empire for generations, still lived in the grand houses near the palace. But their children were leaving, going to universities in other countries, taking positions in businesses that had nothing to do with the state, marrying into families that did not care about lineage. The empire had always been a mosaic, a collection of peoples and languages and traditions held together by a central authority. But the mortar was crumbling, not because of rebellion, not because of invasion, but because people had stopped believing they needed it. They had begun to imagine futures that did not include the empire. Futures that were smaller, perhaps, but also more theirs. And the palace, watching from its hill, could do nothing but observe. It could not stop the new buildings. It could not ban the new ideas. It could not force people to care about something they had moved beyond. The empire had always ruled through presence, through the idea that it was inevitable, unshakable, eternal. But eternity is a story people tell themselves. And when they stop telling it, eternity ends. The Sultan held a council meeting on a day when the rain came down in cold, steady sheets, the kind of rain that makes everything feel heavier. The advisors gathered in the smaller chamber, the one with the fireplace. They were fewer than they used to be. Some positions had not been filled when their previous holders died. Some had been quietly dissolved. The Sultan sat at the head of the table and listened as each advisor gave their report. The Minister of the Treasury spoke of debts and declining revenues. The Minister of War spoke of the need for reforms that would require money the Treasury did not have. The Minister of Foreign Affairs spoke of treaties that needed to be renegotiated, alliances that were fraying, neighbors who were becoming less neighborly. The Sultan listened. He asked a few questions. He made a few notes. But he did not offer solutions. Because there were no solutions. Not real ones. Only choices about what to preserve and what to let go. One of the younger advisors, a man who had studied in Europe and returned full of ideas, suggested a series of reforms. Modernization. Restructuring. A new approach to governance that would make the empire more competitive, more efficient, more able to survive in a changing world. The older advisors listened politely. But they did not respond with enthusiasm. They had heard these ideas before. They had seen attempts at reform. Some had succeeded in small ways. Most had failed. Not because the ideas were bad, but because reform requires energy. It requires belief. It requires a population that wants to be reformed. And the empire was tired. The meeting ended with no decisions made. Just agreements to reconvene, to study the issues further, to seek more information. The advisors left quietly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. The Sultan remained at the table for a long time after they were gone, staring at the fire, watching the flames consume the wood, knowing that fire cannot burn forever, that eventually, even the brightest flame runs out of fuel. In the smaller towns and villages far from the capital, life continued in rhythms that had not changed in centuries. Farmers planted and harvested. Shepherds moved their flocks across the same hills their ancestors had walked. Markets opened at dawn and closed at dusk. The people knew they were part of an empire. They paid their taxes, when collectors, by the quality of the soil, by the health of their animals, by the marriages of their children. When news came from the capital, it was often old news, months out of date, and it rarely affected them directly. A new governor, a change in tax rates, a war that was happening in a place they could not picture. They absorbed the information and then returned to their work. Because work was what mattered. Survival was what mattered. The empire had always been something above them. A distant structure that provided order, protection, a sense of identity. But it had never been close. And now, as it grew more distant, the change was subtle. Life did not collapse. It simply continued. The villages were not falling apart. They were not rebelling. They were not angry. They were just going on, with or without the empire. Because that is what people do. They adapt. They survive. They find ways to live that do not depend on the permanence of any single system. And perhaps that was the empire's greatest failure. Not that it fell, but that when it did, so few people noticed. The mosques were still full on Fridays. The call to prayer still echoed across the city 5 times a day. The faith that had once driven the empire's expansion, that had unified its diverse peoples, that had provided a sense of divine purpose, was still present. But it was quieter now, more personal, less imperial. The grand mosques built by sultans of the past still stood as monuments to devotion and power. But the new mosques being built were smaller, simpler, community spaces rather than declarations of dominance. The imams preached. They spoke of devotion, of charity, of the responsibilities of the faithful. But they rarely spoke of conquest. They rarely spoke of the empire's divine mission. Those sermons belonged to an earlier time, a time when faith and power had been intertwined so completely that they seemed inseparable. Now, faith remained, but power had become something else, something more fragile, something that could not be prayed into existence. The people still believed, but their belief was not in the empire. It was in something beyond the empire, something that would remain even after the empire was gone. And perhaps that was the truest sign that the end was near. When people began to look past the present, when they began to invest their hopes in a future that did not include the structures they had always known, when they began to prepare, quietly, for life after the palace gardens had once been immaculate. Every hedge trimmed, every flower bed weeded, every fountain running clear. They had been a symbol of control, of the ability to impose order even on nature. Now, the gardens were still beautiful, but they were wilder. The hedges had grown uneven. The flower beds mixed with weeds that no one had time to remove. The fountains still ran, but some had developed leaks, and the water pooled in places it was not meant to go. The head gardener was an old man who had served the palace for 40 years. He still did his work, but he no longer had the staff he once commanded. The younger gardeners had left for better pay elsewhere, and the palace had not replaced them. So he did what he could. He focused on the areas that were most visible. The courtyard near the main entrance, The paths the Sultan walked, the rest, he let go. Not out of laziness, but out of practicality. He was one man, and the gardens were vast. He had made peace with it. He understood that perfection was no longer the goal. Maintenance was. Preservation was. Keeping enough alive that it still felt like a garden, but not so much that it broke him trying. Sometimes, in the early morning, he would walk through the wilder parts, the sections where the roses had grown over the paths, where the ivy had climbed the walls without permission, and he found them beautiful in a way the manicured sections were not. They were honest. They showed what happened when control relaxed, when nature was allowed to be itself. And he wondered if the empire was like that. If maybe, when the control finally let go, what remained would be something different. Not ruined, just returned to a more natural state. The treasuries were still full, technically. There were vaults beneath the palace that held gold and jewels and artifacts collected over centuries. There was wealth. On paper, the empire was still rich. But wealth that cannot be moved is not really wealth. It is just heavy. The empire's debts were growing. The income from taxes was shrinking. The cost of maintaining the state, even in its reduced form, was constant. There were discussions about selling some of the treasures, melting down the gold, using the jewels to pay off loans. But every time the suggestion was made, it was met with resistance. Not from greed, but from the sense that selling the treasures would be an admission, that it would cross a line from struggling to surrender. So the treasures remained, locked away, guarded, counted, but not used. And the debts continued to grow. The foreign banks were patient. They did not demand immediate payment. They renegotiated terms, extended deadlines, but they also charged interest. And interest, over time, becomes its own weight. The ministers of the treasury spent their days shuffling numbers, finding small efficiencies, delaying payments, borrowing from one creditor to pay another. It was not sustainable. Everyone knew it was not sustainable. But sustainability was a problem for the future. And the future kept getting pushed further away, until the future became the present. And the present became impossible to ignore. There were fewer festivals, fewer parades, fewer public celebrations of the empire's glory. Not because they had been banned, but because they had become too expensive, too exhausting, too much of a reminder of what used to be. The last great festival had been 10 years ago, a celebration of the Sultan's accession to the throne. The streets had been decorated. There had been music and dancing and free food for the crowds. It had been magnificent. It had also been exhausting. And when it was over, the treasury had been noticeably lighter. The staff had been noticeably more tired. And the sense of mandatory joy had left everyone feeling hollow. So the festival stopped, quietly, without announcement, and life went on without them. The people found other ways to celebrate, smaller ways, private ways, weddings and births and harvests, things that mattered to them directly, things that did not require the empire's approval or participation. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe the empire had always been too large for joy, too distant for celebration. Maybe joy was something that belonged to individuals, to families, to communities, not to sprawling, fading structures that could barely remember why they had started celebrating in the first place. The young sultan, the one who had taken the throne in the final years, was not a weak man. He was not foolish. He had been educated well. He understood history. He understood the empire's challenges. But he also understood something his predecessors had not. That understanding does not equal control. That knowledge does not equal power. He had tried reforms. Some had worked. Most had been blocked by bureaucracies too entrenched to change, by advisors too loyal to the past, by a population too tired to care. He had tried to modernize the military. The older generals had resisted. He had tried to reform the tax system. The regional governors had found ways around it. He had tried to reach out to the younger generation, to the ones who had studied abroad, who had new ideas. But they looked at him with pity, because they knew what he was trying to do. And they knew it was too late. He was not ruling an empire. He was managing its decline. And there is a difference. One requires vision. The other requires acceptance. He spent his evenings reading history mostly, the stories of other empires, Rome, Persia, Byzantium. He found comfort in the knowledge that he was not the first to stand on this particular precipice, that every great power eventually reached this point. That decline was not failure. It was inevitability. But comfort is not the same as peace. And late at night, when the palace was silent, he would sit by the window and look out at the city and wonder what would come next. Not for the empire. He knew what was coming for the empire. But for the people. For the land. For the idea that had once held everything together. Would it disappear? Would it transform? Would something new rise from what remained? He did not know. And in a strange way, not knowing was a relief. Because it meant the story was not over. It was just changing. And change, even painful change, was still a form of life. The bureaucrats were the last to leave. Not because they were the most loyal, but because they had nowhere else to go. They had spent their lives in the machinery of the empire, filling out forms, processing requests, maintaining records. They knew the system better than anyone. They were the ones who kept it running, even when no one was paying attention, even when the policies they enforced no longer made sense, even when the empire they served was more memory than reality. They came to their offices every day. They sat at their desks. They moved papers from one stack to another. They wrote reports that no one read. They followed procedures that no one remembered the reason for. And they did it all with a kind of grim professionalism. Because this was their work. This was what they knew. And as long as they kept working, the empire was still real. At least to them. But even they were aging. Even they were being replaced, slowly, by a new generation that did not have the same attachment. That saw the bureaucracy as a job, not a calling. That understood they were maintaining a fiction. And one by one, the old bureaucrats retired, or died, or simply stopped coming. And the offices grew quieter. The stacks of paper grew higher. The procedures became more and more disconnected from any practical purpose. Until finally, the bureaucracy itself became a kind of monument. A preserved specimen of something that had once been vital. Still technically functioning. But no longer alive. The final treaties were signed in rooms that felt too large. The empire gave up territories it could no longer defend. It accepted terms it would have rejected a century ago. It acknowledged new borders, new nations, new powers that had not existed when it was young. The diplomats who signed these treaties were professionals. They did not weep. They did not rage. They simply signed. Because this was their job. And they understood that sometimes a job is just about making the best of what cannot be changed. The foreign diplomats were respectful. They did not gloat. They did not celebrate. They simply accepted what was being given and made arrangements for the transition. There were ceremonies, brief speeches, photographs taken for newspapers in other countries. And then it was done. The empire was smaller. The maps were redrawn. And life continued. The people in the territories that had been ceded did not riot. They did not resist. Some were relieved. Some were indifferent. Some were sad in the way you are sad when something familiar ends, even if it was never particularly good. But they adapted, because people always adapt. And the empire, watching from its capital, could do nothing but accept. Because acceptance was all that remained. In the final years, the palace felt less like a center of power and more like a museum. Tourists began to visit, not in large numbers, but enough to be noticed. They walked through the halls with guides who pointed out the history. The throne room where great decisions had been made. The gardens where sultans had walked. The libraries where scholars had studied. The tourists took photographs. They bought postcards. They marveled at the architecture. And then they left. And the palace remained. Still functioning, technically. Still housing a government, though a much smaller one. Still flying the flag. Still holding on to the appearance of continuity. But everyone knew. The staff knew. The remaining advisors knew. The Sultan knew. This was not a living empire. This was its afterimage. The light that remains for a moment after the source has been extinguished. And that was all right. Because afterimages are important. They remind you that something was there. They give you time to adjust to the darkness. They are not the thing itself. But they are not nothing. The last sultan did not abdicate with a grand speech. There was no dramatic moment. No final declaration. The empire simply stopped. One day there was a government. The next day there was a different government. One day there was an empire. The next day there was a republic. The transition was messy. There were arguments about what to preserve and what to discard. About who had the right to claim the empire's legacy. About what the new nation would be. But through it all, there was a sense of inevitability. This had been coming for a long time. Everyone had known it. And when it finally happened, it felt less like a shulk and more like the final exhale of something that had been holding its breath for decades. The Sultan left the palace quietly. He did not take much with him. Some books, some personal items. He was not exiled. He was not imprisoned. He simply left. And the palace, for the first time in centuries, had no sultan. The rooms that had been his were closed. The throne was removed, not destroyed, just stored. Because even the new government understood that some things should not be erased. That history, even difficult history, even painful history, was still history. And forgetting it would not make the present any clearer. The empire did not end with an explosion. It ended with a series of quiet closings. Doors that were no longer opened. Lamps that were no longer lit. Conversations that trailed off without conclusion. It ended the way most things end. Not with drama, but with exhaustion. With the recognition that continuing required more than was available. More energy. More belief. More reason. And so it stopped. Not all at once, but gradually. The way a fire dies when there is no more wood to burn. The way a song ends when the singer runs out of breath. The way the sun sets when the day is done. And maybe that was the most honest ending it could have had. Because empires, for all their grandeur, are human things. And human things do not last forever. They rise. They shine. They cast long shadows. And then they rest. And the rest is not a failure. It is simply the natural end of a long effort. The empire had been many things. Glorious. Terrible. Complex. Simple. Cruel. Kind. It had been all the contradictions that human societies always are. And now it was something else. A memory. A lesson. A story that would be told in different ways by different people. Some would remember the glory. Some would remember the oppression. Some would remember the art. Some would remember the horse. All of them would be right. Because empires are too large to be remembered as a single thing. They are fractured. Reflected. Refracted. They mean different things to different people. And that multiplicity is its own kind of immortality. Not the immortality of never ending, but the immortality of never being forgotten on the night when the last official document was signed, when the final transfer of power was complete, when the empire officially ceased to exist as a political entity. There were no crowds in the streets, no celebrations, no riots, just people going about their evenings, eating dinner, putting children to bed, talking about tomorrow's weather or next week's work. And maybe that was the most profound thing. That life continued. That the end of an empire was not the end of the world. That people found ways to live, to hope, to build, even without the structure they had known for so long. The palace stood on its hill. Dark now, except for a few windows where caretakers still worked. The domes and minarets still broke the skyline. The walls still remembered everything they had seen. But they were no longer the walls of an empire. They were just walls. Old ones. Beautiful ones. But just walls. And in the morning, when the sun rose, it rose over a different world. Not a better one, necessarily. Not a worse one. Just a different one. A world where the empire was past tense. Where its story had moved from the present to the history books. Where it had become something to study rather than something to serve. And maybe that was all right. Maybe every story needs an ending. Even the long ones. Even the complicated ones. Even the ones that feel like they should go on forever. Because nothing goes on forever. Not empires. Not nations. Not even stars. Everything has its time. And when that time ends, the only thing to do is close your eyes. Let go of the effort. And sleep. Not the sleep of death, but the sleep of something that has worked hard and earned its rest. The sleep of something that was, and might someday be remembered. The sleep of an empire that did not fall, but simply closed its eyes and dreamed of quieter things. Some empires crumble. Some burn. Some are torn apart by war or revolution or the violent will of those they oppressed. But some, a rare few, simply choose to stop. They do not collapse. They settle. They fold themselves away like a letter that has been read and understood. They become memory not through destruction but through transformation. Through the quiet acknowledgement that their time has passed. That they have given what they could. That the world has moved on. And that moving on is not betrayal. It is just the way things are. The Ottoman Empire did not die. It grew tired. It spent centuries burning bright, expanding, conquering, building, ruling. And then, slowly, it ran out of fuel. Not because it was defeated, but because the act of being an empire is exhausting. Because holding together so many pieces, so many peoples, so many contradictions, requires a kind of energy that cannot be sustained forever. And when that energy finally ran out, the empire did not scream. It did not fight. It did not rage against the dying of its light. It simply exhaled. And in that exhale, it let go of everything it had been holding. The territories, the power, the illusion of permanence. And what remained was not nothing. It was something quieter, something smaller, something more human. The people, the land, the stories, the faith, the art, the memory of what had been. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all it ever needed to be. The stones of the palace still stand. The minarets still point toward the sky. The walls still remember the weight they have carried. But they are lighter now, unburdened by the need to be more than they are. They are history. They are beautiful. They are old. And they are at peace. Because peace is what comes when effort ends. When the struggle to maintain, to control, to continue, finally gives way to acceptance, to the understanding that some things are not meant to last, that impermanence is not failure, that even the greatest powers are temporary, and that temporary does not mean meaningless. The empire mattered. It shaped the world. It left marks that will never be erased. But it was also just one chapter in a much longer story. A story that began before it and will continue long after. And maybe the greatest gift an empire can give is to recognize when its chapter is done. To close the book gently. To let the next chapter begin. Not with bitterness. Not with regret. But with the quiet dignity of something that knows it has lived fully. That has burned as brightly as it could for as long as it could. And that now, finally, can rest, and so the empire sleeps. Not in death, but in the deep, peaceful sleep of something that has completed its work. Its breath is slow. Its dreams are soft. And in those dreams, perhaps, it remembers the conquests, the art, the gardens, the prayers, the people, the long centuries of being more than any one thing could be. And maybe, in those dreams, it smiles, because it knows that it was, that it mattered, that it will be remembered. And that is enough. Some empires fall, but this one simply closed its eyes, and in the closing, found a peace that eluded it for so long. The peace of letting go, the peace of being done, the peace of sleep.